This is Chapter 14, APUSH online lecture titled The American Economy. In this lecture we're going to deal with two separate topics. We're going to deal with immigration during the mid-1800s as well as America's first industrial revolution. Before we get to the actual immigration in America during this time period, we need to do kind of an overall introduction to immigration anyway. And the first thing you always look at is why do people leave where they're from and come to the places where they're at. And these are called push and pull factors. As far as the things that pull people towards a country, region, whatever it is, in other words, the things that make them want to go there. In the case of us, we're more or less talking about opportunity. Now, these can be included in several things, like freedom or economic opportunity or abundant land or whatever it is. It's something that makes people want to go to the place they're going. As far as the push factors, are the things that make people want to leave where they're at. There's several reasons this can happen. One can be population growth and the lack of opportunity that comes along with it. Two can be agricultural changes, be it something called the enclosure system that happened in England back in the day. I think it was in chapter 1 of your book. It can be climate change. It can be a shift over to industrial economy, things like that. Three can be crop failures, which will tie into the Irish that we'll look at in a second. Four can be the Industrial Revolution, and five can be religious and political turmoil. So all these factors put together explain the reasons why people move from one place to another on a mass scale. So the first thing we're going to look at is Irish immigration, and like anything else, you've got to figure out the causes of it. Now, in the 1840s, a potato famine hit Ireland. Now, on its face, that wouldn't be so dramatic, but the potato at this time was a staple crop of Ireland. In other words, a lot of their nutritional basis, a lot of their meals were based around this. So when it fails, 3 years in a row, the effects are just catastrophic. Like over 750,000 people die, and it leads to a mass immigration, not only to the United States, but other parts of the world. And it's the reason for a lot of Irish Americans being in this country today, to the point where today there's more Irish Americans in this country than there are actual Irish people in Ireland. As far as the characteristics of this Irish immigration, they were by far the largest group that came over 2 million people between the years 1830 and 1860. And when they got here, they normally settled in the larger cities on the eastern seaboard, like New York, Boston, and places like that, because they were just simply too poor to go anywhere else. Like, these people were the epitome of poverty when they came over and just kind of had to settle where they could, close to where they arrived. Also, and we'll look at this more in class, they faced a wide variety of discrimination when they came over, to the point where when it came to jobs and things, you can see right here, it was actually part of the application or part of the ad in the paper that no Irish need apply for the job. And like I said, we'll deal with that more as we get into class. Moving from Irish immigration for a second to the causes of German immigration during the same time period, and there were tons of Germans who came over as well, along with the Irish. The causes for them coming over were just a couple of them. Crop failures, number one, because Europe during this time period is going through something called the Little Ice Age, and you start to see reduced yields and things like that. To where countries can't support their people when it comes to food. Also, Europe, and particularly Germany, is going through a series of revolutions during this time period that are causing all the problems that are normally associated with them. Lack of opportunity, a lot of those push factors that I talked about earlier. And so for that reason, they decided to start immigrating from Germany to other places. And a lot of these people had to come to America because other countries in Europe during this time would not accept German immigrants. So this was kind of their last option and their only place to go. When the Germans got here, and there were about 1 million of them that came between the same time period of 1830 and 1860, they had a little bit more of an advantage when they got here as opposed to the Irish. They had a little bit more money in their pocket. They had a little bit more economic opportunity when they got here. So for that reason, they moved as a majority, not all of them, but more of the German immigrants than Irish moved to the middle of the country, to places like St. Louis and in Iowa and Indiana and places like this. And they became farmers because they had the money that would allow them to set up farms. As far as the characteristics of them, the first one is they were isolationists. They didn't really get involved in government or politics at the first because of the situation that they left behind. They felt like it wasn't worth the trouble to get involved in it, like too much bad could come from it. So for that reason, they were like, look, just leave us alone, let us farm and all that, and we'll be cool. Also, they were more educated as opposed to other immigrants who came around during this time, and also they introduced a couple of cultural components to the United States on a wide scale. The first of all is beer, which if you go back to the map we just looked at, is why a lot of distilleries and a lot of breweries in this country today are located in the upper Midwestern portion of the United States, and also the Christmas tree as well. So we move away from some of the characteristics of the immigrants during this time period to the reactions that inevitably come up because of the groups of new people coming in. And the reaction during this time period is something called nativism, which is what we'll handle in the next couple of slides. The reaction of people in the country to these new immigrants, kind of at the end of the day, boils down to the fear of a loss of political and economic power. Okay, they were worried that because a lot of the Irish that came in, or the Irish that came in, were of the Catholic religion, there was a lot of threat to Protestants during this time. They felt like they were going to be overwhelmed, both culturally, politically, economically, and all this kind of stuff. Part of this stems from the basis, and it's the Catholic-Protestant split that had been happening in Europe and the conflicts that came from it for several hundred years before this. And also because they thought that Catholics, they felt like Catholicism was a foreign church. It wasn't Christianity. It wasn't the Protestant religion that they had. Out of this nativism comes an actual political party called the Know Nothing Party in 1849. They were for a couple of things as far as what their platform stood for. The first was immigration restrictions. And a couple of things tying into that. They were concerned, they wanted to lengthen the amount of time it took for an immigrant to become citizens. And it ties back to that political power and all that I talked about earlier. And more importantly, they wanted to make sure that it took longer for these people to become voters, once again tying into politics. They wanted to prevent immigrants from holding public office and other things like that. And also, kind of tied into that, they wanted to deport paupers or beggars. In other words, they felt if you weren't coming in and contributing to the country, then you didn't need to be here, and they wanted to send these people back. So that was a brief introduction to the first main topic of this chapter, and obviously we'll handle all these things more in-depthly in class. So that kind of closes out immigration for now, and we'll move on towards America's Industrial Revolution and some of the inventors and some of the innovations and things that kind of lead us into the place that we are today with manufacturing, production, and all this kind of stuff. The guy that gets this all started, and we're going back a little bit here to 1791, but a guy named Samuel Slater is known as the father of the factory system because he built the first factory of cotton spinning machines in the United States back during this time period after the Revolutionary War. What makes Slater fascinating and everything is the fact that during this time period that we're talking about, and once again it's before where we're at, Britain was going through their own industrial revolution, and they were very protective of any inventions, any plans, blueprints, or anything that they had with regards to how they produced their goods, to the point where they would prosecute you and see it as a crime if you took some of their what's called intellectual property out of the country and took it somewhere else. And it's mainly to protect their industries and make sure that no one else can build stuff the way that they can. Well, Slater was an apprentice in a cotton factory, cotton spinning factory, and over time he memorized the blueprints for how the machines worked and all this stuff. And he comes to the United States with this stuff in his head. So imagine having an entire factory system memorized with blueprints and specifications and all this stuff, having it memorized in your head and coming across and being able to build a factory. And that's what he did. He meets up with a guy in Rhode Island, and they build the first factory, which you can see in the bottom right there. Next on our list is Eli Whitney. Now, we'll talk about in a couple chapters on down the road about how the cotton gin was really the revitalizing effect in the boom in slavery that happens during this time period. And it all comes about from his invention of the cotton gin. One of the key words to remember, and I'll say it a couple times as we go, and I'll say it in class a million times, the key words to remember when we talk about the Industrial Revolution or anything like that is these people were finding out ways to make products quicker, easier, and cheaper. All right, that's what it boils down to at the end of the day. And that's what the cotton gin did. It took a very laborious, very time-consuming process, and it broke it down, and it narrowed down the time that it took to do it, and it made it a lot cheaper. The effects of it, and we'll talk about how this thing worked in class, but the effects of it is cotton once again becomes profitable. As it becomes profitable, people start reinvesting that money by buying more slaves. So slavery as a whole increases during the South, and it also kind of stems westward expansion because as your profits go up and as you buy more slaves and as you produce more product, you need more land to grow cotton. So people start buying land towards the west to be able to produce more cotton. Whitney also comes up with the concept of interchangeable parts, which is the basis of mass production. In other words, it means that you're making each individual component of a product separately. Okay, so to give you an idea of how it worked before, if you had a gun or something like that and the trigger or a part or whatever it is on the gun went out or broke, you had to buy a new gun. Well, with interchangeable parts, you could now replace it with the individual part of it. And it made it better for the consumer because they could not have to replace the whole product, and it made it easier to build products as well on the factory side of it because now people could have individual jobs instead of having to craft the entire product. So once again, quicker, easier, and cheaper with production, and also on the back end of it, easier for consumers. So kind of a better process all around. Next is Elias Howe and Isaac Singer with a sewing machine, which for our purposes really got the factory system going. Okay, it took clothing manufacturing, which was a major industry in the United States at this time, from a home process where things were individually put together in different homes and all this, and put everything under one roof with the factory. And that's kind of the key, is the factory system, where you can produce something from start to finish under one roof. Next is Charles Goodyear with his process of vulcanization of rubber. Now, the way that this helps out is rubber as a natural product comes from a tree, mainly during this time period in Central Africa. It's not an easy product to work. When it gets hot, it gets very sticky. It gets almost impossible to mold into something or to work with. And on the flip side, when it gets cold, it becomes very brittle and it breaks. Well, Goodyear, through chemistry and all these things you can ask Dr. Parr, because I don't know about, came up with this system to make it workable no matter what state it's in. So you could work with it when it was hot or cold, and it made it more easily be allowed to be made into tires and other things like that. Moving along to Samuel Morse. Now, we're kind of getting out of the factory system for one shot here, and we're talking about communication. Now, we'll talk more as we go down the road about how communication, innovations, and inventions can impact business and can impact industry. But this is kind of the first example of instant communication. Okay, he invents the telegraph, as you can see right there. And for the first time, you can send a message to someone almost instantaneously, which you couldn't before. You had to wait for a letter to be delivered, whether it's by horse, steamboat, boat, railroad, whatever it is. It took a while to get that stuff back and forth, so it made communication a little bit more difficult than it was after he invented this thing. From there to Francis Cabot Lowe in 1814, he was the guy who built the first start-to-finish factory. Okay, so in other words, the factory took a raw material, whatever it was, in this case I guess it's cotton, took cotton and converted it or made it into a shirt. So in every step of the process was done in one place, and it kind of signifies the birth of the modern factory system that we have today. Significance, obviously, it changes everything to a total factory process. You didn't have to worry about products being semi-produced in separate places and then brought together and finished in one. You could do everything under one roof. So, with this factory system, the center of it, and once again, excuse the format, and I can't change it on this, it looks better on the actual PowerPoint, but the center of all this industry, of all this factory system, is New England, and it's for several reasons. Number one, they were never able to establish an agriculture base because of their geographic factors, the stony soil, the climate, and all these things. So they had to come up with some other way to make money. Second of all, they had a huge population due to the immigration that we've already looked at with the Irish and German immigrants. So they had a ready labor supply. So there were plenty of people available to work in these factories once they built them. They also had ports. Being on the Atlantic seaboard, they had easy access to European and other markets. So for the imports and exports, it was the ideal location for that. And last but not least, these factories, look, we don't have electricity yet or anything like that. To power these factories, you have to be located on a water source to spin the wheel and create the power and all this. And there are a lot of rivers in New England that are easily able to be turned into a power source for these factories. So for all these reasons, New England becomes the center of this quote-unquote industrial revolution that we're looking at. So when these factories get going and everything, the next thing we need to look at is how it impacted people. In other words, what was it like to work in these factories for immigrants and people during this time period? And I'll just be flat out honest with you, it sucked. All right, there are incredibly long hours, multiple days during the week. You're not getting paid a whole lot. There's no ventilation. There's no climate control. There's no OSHA. There's no safety administration to come in and make sure that you're not going to die while you're doing this or have an arm ripped off or something. It is a horrible, brutal experience for these people. And for this, they become known as wage slaves. And as we go forward, we're going to look at some of the comparisons between slavery, and I'm just strictly talking working conditions, not the loss of freedom or anything, but the working conditions of slaves and of northern industrial workers. And you'll be kind of surprised at how they kind of match up and all this kind of stuff. But bottom line on it, not good working in a factory back then. Moving on for a second from some of the factory inventions and innovations to some of the things that were happening in agriculture as well. Because remember, quicker, easier, and cheaper is the theme of this chapter, and that applies both to factories and industrial goods as well as methods and production of farming. And we'll look at some of the inventions and some of the things real quick that kind of help move this along as well during this time period. First farming invention we'll look at is the steel plow, which was invented by a guy named John Deere, who, being around this area, you should know or at least be aware of. The steel plow, once again, quicker, easier, cheaper. All right, it allowed you to till more acres, it allowed you to plow more acres, it allowed you to plow more deeply in the ground and therefore turn the soil over and get more nutrients to the top, which increases the amount of product or the amount of crops that you can grow. As you can see, we've come a long way from the steel plow that John Deere invented in the mid-1850s to what we use today. That's kind of a smaller version of what most farmers around here use. It's known as a disc. And you can see kind of how the change over time happens. Basically, all that's happened is this right here has turned into multiple plows along the way. Next is the mower reaper, invented by Cyrus McCormick. Once again, it's a way to more quickly, more cheaply, and more easily get your product out of the field and get it to market so you can make money. As you can see, it's basically a early version of a combine, which you see over here on the right. Now, for those of you in my class, you'll know that I've spent pretty much the last month on one of these, shelling corn, cutting beans, and etc. So what I am on today and what I spend a lot of my time after school on derives from the basic thing that you see here on the left. But bottom line on it, it helps you get your product out, helps you get your crop out more quickly, more easily, and more cheaply. The results of this and the importance, which is really what we're worried about at the end of the day, are pretty significant here. We begin to move from a subsistence agricultural society to a cash crop society. In other words, we go from a lot of small farmers producing corn, beans, whatever crop it is, for themselves and to be able to live on, into actually selling it for a profit and actually getting it out on the market. So when you have these new technological inventions, you can farm on a much larger scale and you can produce more crop and you don't have to use as much of it, or you have surplus to be able to sell. Also debt. Look, it costs money to put a crop in, and I know this better than anybody. So you've got to borrow money to put your crop in, and hopefully you'll be able to pay it back at the end of the year when you harvest that crop. That works most of the time today, but back then it was a little bit more of a precarious or a little bit more of a sticky situation. Also, a saturation of the home market. As these innovations come around, as these inventions come around, we produce more product, and to be honest with you, we don't have enough people in the country to be able to buy all these products, so you begin to saturate it. When that happens, prices go down. When that happens, it's harder to pay back debt. So all of these results right here, sorry about that, all of these results right here kind of tie into each other. And also, because of the saturation of the home market, we begin to look for new markets, particularly South America, Europe, and places like that, where we still sell crops today. The last thing that comes about during this time period is the transportation revolution. Now, I'm going to blow through this pretty quickly. You just need to have a basic knowledge of what the different components are and kind of how they impacted things. So to make this a little bit quicker on you, I'm just going to kind of highlight the main points and we'll move on from there. First thing we're going to look at is the motive for this transportation revolution, and once again I apologize for the formatting. For whatever reason this one did not transfer correctly. What that says by that bullet point is the motive for the transportation revolution was a desire for the eastern part of the country to tap the resources of the western part. In other words, find a way to get products from the west to the east, here we go again, quickly, cheaply, easily. Okay? That's all they're trying to do. So all these things that we look at and all these infrastructure and roads and canals and all this all stems back to trying to get agricultural products and what have you back to the east more quickly. The significance of this revolution is for the first time, it kind of creates a national market economy. In other words, different sections of the country are tied together, be it agriculture, industrial, what have you, okay? Everything kind of begins tied together in a national market. And also regional specialization, which we'll talk about a little bit more in class, but everybody kind of picks out their things, becomes good at it, and works from there. The first part of this revolution is roads, all right, and more particularly turnpikes. The first one is created way back before the time period we're talking, well, not way back, but back before the time period we're talking about in 1790 with the Lancaster Turnpike, which was the first, I guess you could call it, long-ranging, long road that we built in this country. We moved from there to the Cumberland Road in 1811, as you can see right here, the route that it runs. from Vandalia to Cumberland and back and forth, provides, once again, keywords, cheaper freight, and also it's a pretty standard practice. When you put a road, when you put a railroad, when you build anything out west during this time period, and it's kind of to a certain extent today, land values around it will rise because inevitably there's going to be towns that spring up. There's going to be support people that come up with businesses and complementary industries and things like this that basically make the road profitable or make it worth building. Next on the list are canals, and more specifically the Erie Canal, which was built in 1825, and it linked up Buffalo, New York, and New York City. Now, for our purposes, you don't need to know the ins and outs and how it was built and all that, but the bottom line on it is, and what you need to know is that it made things quicker and faster. All right, it dropped the shipping cost of products from around $100 to $5, and it also cut down the travel time between Buffalo and New York City from 20 days to 6 days. So significant, ridiculous improvements in both of these things, and made it profitable for the people who bought it, and seemed to be, or came about as a great investment. Also during this time, while they're building the canals, they're also focusing on some of the problems that are coming about with river travel. And there's a couple of reasons that made it difficult. A, it's very, very difficult to travel during this time upstream on a river because you basically have to paddle. All right, you don't get to float down the current, you've got to paddle against it. And also, you got to deal with climatological or weather problems, more specifically these rivers drying up during the summer. In other words, the level of the river gets so low that the boat drags on the bottom, and you got to take it out and basically drag it wherever you're going. So there's some problems associated with it and the manual labor that goes along with river travel. As a way to try to alleviate this or make it easier, Robert Fulton in 1807 comes up with a steam engine and kind of puts it into effect over here. Basically what it did, and it's running a boat on steam power is all it is at the end of the day, but it made rivers into the interstate system of that time. You had two-way highways. It was just as easy to go downriver as upriver, and it made things quicker, easier, and cheaper to be able to transport products, people, everything like that. So to kind of sum all this up with the effects of the Industrial Revolution, and it's on the next slide, but I'll go ahead and go through it. The three words once again: quicker, easier, cheaper. I know you're tired of me saying it, but it's got to be hammered in your head about why this revolution came about and what were the effects of it. Along with that, you also had the regional specialization that I talked about earlier, and I'll go across it in a second. As far as the specialization, the East begins to totally focus on industry. The South is still, at this time, tied to King Cotton, which we'll talk about a couple chapters from now, and is still based on a plantation agricultural system. And the West becomes the breadbasket, okay? That's where the major crops for food are grown: corn, beans, wheat, things like that. So everybody kind of finds their wheelhouse and becomes expert at their industry. Now there's advantages and disadvantages to that we'll talk about later, but for now you just need to know out of it came this specialization. Alright, that wraps up the Chapter 14 online lection notes. We'll move on next time into reformers and abolition and later on into slavery.